Okay, we're going to look at how the Cold War changes Europe in the years kind of immediately following World War II and then really carrying all the way up through the 70s and 80s and just trying to understand changes that happen within various countries in Europe, specifically the Soviet Union, but also as a whole, how is Europe responding to this Cold War and what's going on around them. So let's first start with looking at the Soviet Union, and we'll look at the last few years of Stalin. So during World War II, Stalin realized that he had to relax some of his policies in terms of secret policing and oppression of people and sending peasants to death camps because they needed them for the war effort. So it was a little bit less totalitarian during the war, but immediately following the war, he goes back to full Stalin mode and full oppression of everybody he disagrees with. And so that results in large purges of Western influence because he's afraid that these Western influences are going to corrupt the communist socialism that he had developed in the Soviet Union. So the people who quickly find themselves on Stalin's hit list include artists, soldiers who had served with distinction, but maybe had spent a little too much time with their American or British counterparts and may start having wrong ideas. He also took out communist resistant leaders because they were a threat to his leadership position and people looked to them as a rallying cry. So he kind of tried to get rid of any of those that were within his grasp. And then he targets the Jews of the Soviet Union because they are more cultured, more worldly, and more Western than the rest of the Soviet populace was. And so Stalin really looks for them. The Communist Party holds complete control, of course, with Stalin as their leader. And they really refocus in on these 5-year plans, continuing to develop those, with the focus specifically being on the military and heavy industry. The result is that immediately following World War II, there is a shift away from any consumer goods, housing, and agriculture. So because of all of this, the quality of life in the Soviet Union really drops drastically immediately following World War II because the Soviet planned economy, this state-run economy, is not focusing on people's livelihoods, but rather focusing on the military and heavy industry. And so life is pretty difficult for a while. He also used the Red Army and the secret police to create governments who were friendly to him throughout Eastern Europe and in lands that had been occupied by the Soviet Union. So that's Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and so on and so forth. The only exception to this in Eastern Europe is in Yugoslavia, where Josip Tito, who is a communist and did lead the resistance, manages to kind of withdraw. He resists Soviet influence because the Red Army never really shows up in Yugoslavia. And so because of that, he's able to build his own resistance movement and really establish himself as the leader there. So, of course, Stalin can't live forever. He does eventually die in 1953. And this leads to a process known as De-Stalinization. And that's led by a guy by the name of Nikita Khrushchev. And Khrushchev comes to power as a reformer, as the head of the reform group within the Communist Party. So he's obviously still very much a communist, but he's more reform-oriented than Stalin was. And Khrushchev and the other reformers blame Stalin's tactics, his heavy-handedness, for the struggles of the Soviet Union, both economically and politically. So he argues that because Stalin has alienated the West and the rest of the world, the Soviet economy is going to struggle. And because he's targeted the peasants and the people within the country, their economy is failing and people don't respect the Soviet Union. So he really looks to kind of put some distance between himself and Stalin and Stalin's ideas. So they keep the 5-year plans, but they shift away from only heavy industry and military and begin producing consumer goods. Workers begin to have a little more self-control and freedom just a little more freedom in general. The secret police is restructured and they lose some of their power. And artists and writers are encouraged to produce plays and art and novels that can be about anything. And in fact, a number of them take shots at Stalin. Despite all of this, Communist Party, of course, still stays in power. but he reshakes it so that a lot of new members are coming into play and are becoming involved in the Communist Party. And these new members are really bringing in new ideas and new life to the party. So another part of Khrushchev is he kind of, initially at least, sparks a change in foreign policy. Unlike Stalin, he believes that the Soviet Union can exist in peaceful coexistence with capitalism. He doesn't think that it's going to be this massive showdown at the end of the world. And so that's really kind of a unique thing. And because of this, he looks to relax Cold War tension. He looks to develop relationships across the world. And starts making inroads into places in Africa and the Middle East and Southeast Asia, even if they aren't communist, but just starts developing relationships with them because he thinks that the Soviet Union, as an international power, can do this without threatening everyone's way of existence. Now, one of the downsides to this is a lot of people think they can take advantage of it. And so we see these lax attitudes lead to rebellion throughout Eastern Europe. And so in Poland in 1956, there's a series of riots that lead to them having more autonomy, that is, less direct control from Moscow and from the Soviet Union. And those spread throughout. And in Hungary in 1956, there's a revolution, which is fine because they're still communist. But eventually those communist leaders say that they're going to end their military alliance with the Soviet Union, and that the Soviet Union can't handle. And so they invade and crush that revolution, putting more pro-Soviets back in power. So although Khrushchev does make some changes, he is still very much a man of his era and is very much trying to keep Eastern Europe under his thumb. And then towards the end of his reign, we do see Khrushchev begin shifting back to traditional Cold War politics. In 1961, he has the Berlin Wall built because the Allied powers refused to withdraw from West Berlin. So he basically, in secret, lays out the plans, and overnight this wall is put up very quickly to seal off Western Europe from the rest of East Germany. And then in 1962, he makes an agreement with Cuba to station nuclear weapons there. The United States catches wind of this, and they're trying to prohibit it, and there is a kind of a standoff that almost leads to a nuclear attack, but eventually an agreement is made that will stop nuclear weapons from going to Cuba. But it is this weakness that eventually Khrushchev's enemies prey on and attack him for, because they're saying he's not standing up well enough to the West, and that he is in fact bullied by the West. So of course eventually his enemies take power. They depose him in a bloodless revolution and really kind of a internal party coup. A conservative group led by Leonid Brezhnev comes to power. These people had been pushing against the reforms of Khrushchev and were very much the new conservative group within the Soviet Union. And so what they wanted to kind of take things back closer to what Stalin had rather than what Khrushchev had. And so the conservatives re-emphasized the power of the Communist Party, and they reinstituted some of the dictatorial powers that they had previously had. They rolled back the liberalization. There was less freedom of speech, less freedom of press, less workers' rights, and there was a more heavy-handed presence of the secret police throughout the Soviet Union. This group under Brezhnev really builds up the nuclear capacity of the Soviet Union. They saw that as being a major problem because the United States took an initial lead in that military buildup, and so Brezhnev saw that as a source of great embarrassment for the Soviet Union. So he institutes a massive arms buildup. As Brezhnev is in control, Czechoslovakia elects a new leader, a reform-minded leader. He's still a communist, but it's Alexander Dubček. And Dubček wants reform. And his whole idea is that he can blend communism with personal freedom and localized democracy. So there's still just one communist party. But on local levels, people could have more say in who's representing them, in what their factories are doing, and what their working conditions are like, and things of that sort. Because of this, people in the Soviet Union who are allied with Brezhnev begin to freak out because they're afraid that very quickly Dubček's going to lead Czechoslovakia out of the Warsaw Pact and possibly into an alliance with Western powers. And so in August of 1968, what we see is that Soviet and their allied troops occupy Czechoslovakia, and they kind of depose Dubček and end the reform movements. And this leads to something known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, where Brezhnev basically says that the Soviet Union and its allies have the right to intervene in any communist country whenever they see the need. The Soviet Union has the right to maintain communist powers. And they show this in Czechoslovakia, and they prove that they'll maintain the status quo of these communist leaders through military force whenever they need it. And so this Brezhnev Doctrine really kind of retrenches the Soviet Union as being in its own little sphere and controlling all of Eastern Europe. So that's the Soviet Union. Now we'll look more broadly at the rest of Europe and really the rest of the world, truly. So around or after 1940, really, and that's so after World War II, we see this merging of theoretical science and practical technology. Really, the technology catches up to the scientific theory, and it begins to merge. And so what we see is practical applications on massive scales for all the science that's being developed at this time and had been developed before. And we really see this a lot during World War II, when scientists are used extensively by governments for military research and military purposes. And we see this specifically in Nazi Germany, but also in the United States with the Manhattan Project, taking a bunch of physicists and building an atomic bomb. And so what this leads to eventually, of course, is an era known as big science, where this theoretical work is mixed with large-scale engineering in massive, massive projects. Now, the problem is that this is really expensive and really risky. And so in order to do this, science needs funding not from traditional sources, and scientists can't self-support themselves. They need money from governments. And so we start to see government funding of scientific projects. And so a lot of them are militarily related in order to maintain the power of the United States and the Soviet Union. This competition, of course, leads to the space race, one of the most famous competitions of the Cold War, where the United States and the Soviet Union are trying to build up their nuclear capacity and their ability to get into space. The Soviets launched the first satellite and man into space, but the United States, quote, wins the space race when they set the first man on the moon. So we see that the US and the USSR are using their massive resources in order to develop huge scientific projects by their government. And Europeans feel like they want to get involved as well, but the problem is because they don't have the numbers in terms of population, they don't have the wealth of these two large countries, they're lagging behind. And a lot of their great scientists are being drawn to the United States because the United States has the money to offer them. So what we see is, in the spirit of cooperation that we have kind of seen throughout this post-World War II Europe, Europeans decide to work together, pool their resources and their minds in order to create kind of a more unified scientific operation to keep up with the U.S. And so in this era, we also see science becoming even more specialized, and it becomes hyper-competitive. We're no longer scientists really like working together to make advances, but they are individually trying to outdo each other and make the next great discovery. We also see real changes in social structure and the class system, if you will. And so we see a real growing middle class, but also a shift in who is in that middle class. And this shift is a result of kind of a changing economy as well. But before, the middle class had been business and landowners, and they represented the middle class. They were the comfortable middle class and trying to reach the kind of the level of the aristocracy. But following World War II, that middle class shifts, and it becomes more of a group of specialized experts and managers within business. And so they are middle class not because of what they own, but because of skills that they have. And that's a real difference, because now middle class is not being passed down by inheritance. Like, I own the land, I give it to my son is now middle class. It's being passed down by opportunity, by access to higher and better education. Like, I was a skilled worker, so I was able to send my son to this school, which has more opportunities. Because of that, he was able to get a better high school level of education and then go on to a better college. And now he has access to higher education to get a better paying job, to be more skilled, more specialized. And so he can maintain that middle class. So we see that there is that shift. And instead of just owning something, they become middle class in part because of their education and in part because of their income. The lower class, we see an even bigger shift away from the countryside and a move by more people to the cities. So it's continuing that shift that began in the Industrial Revolution of people moving from country to the city. And they begin to work in new jobs, though. They're not always looking to work in factory jobs, because some of those manufacturing jobs start to disappear. And what they're looking to work in is service industries and white-collar work. And those are growing at a significant rate. And so those jobs really resemble the middle class in that they aren't necessarily hard labor, but they are semi-skilled work. And so these lower class now look a lot like the middle class, except they don't have the same level of education. So they're not quite doing as much grunt work, but it is still grunt work. During this time, we also see the rise of consumerism. And this is what kind of brings the classes together, or kind of exacerbates class differences in this era, because people want more and they want more things. The rising car industry really kind of gives access to a lot more people to have access to cars, so a lot more people are able to get them, and because of this, it kind of, your book says it democratizes Europe, but it levels the social classes out pretty significantly, because now most working families at this time could afford a car, and so they could afford trips, they could afford kind of the luxuries that came along with that and that status symbol. And so status symbols began to change away from just cars to, but what did you have in your home? Did you have vacuum cleaners? Did you have ovens? What did you have in your home? And so we see this access to gadgets and these demands for gadgets begin to rise really in post-World War II Europe. And because of this, people begin to feel like they can take on debt because they want more of these things, and the economy is growing so well that they figure they can take on debt because they'll be able to pay it off later because they have a good job that's continuing to grow and continuing to raise their income. So they feel confident about that. In addition, we see really the growth of what's known as the welfare state in Europe. So, and this is a conscious effort by the governments of Europe to reduce class tensions and to increase the standard of living for everybody in their countries. Many European countries adopt these social reforms, following in the lines that Bismarck really started, and a lot of countries implement immediately following World War II. So that's unemployment benefits and unemployment insurance, old age pensions to get people retiring, to get younger people into the workforce, and allow people to be comfortable in their old age. Nationalized healthcare system to ensure that everyone has access to healthcare. And then family allowances so that people can afford to have children and take the time off work. And then inexpensive public housing for the kind of lowest classes who are still struggling to get by. And the goal of all of this is, again, one, to promote equality between classes, but Europeans really view this as an opportunity to allow for a humane level of living for all their people. So everyone should have access to these basic necessities in order to have a good quality of life. And that's really fundamentally important to the European system. Women also undergo massive transformations after World War II, and for kind of a number of reasons. But immediately after World War II, there's a boom in birth rates. There's a lot of children are being born. This is called the baby boomer generation, because there is kind of excitement from the war being over. There is a need in a lot of countries to replace the workforce, and there's kind of a sense that the world is safe-ish again. But during the 60s and 70s, the birth rate declined significantly, and by their late 20s, most women were done having children. This meant that they had a lot of life in front of them, and because of this, they started looking for jobs. So by the time their children were going to mandatory public school, these women were in their 30s, and they had all day to figure out something to do. So they start looking for jobs. And they're able to find jobs for kind of three reasons. First is that there's a demand for labor because of the economic boom following World War II. So that helps because all these companies need workers. Secondly, there's a shift in the economy away from the old heavy industry to the new service industry. And that's jobs that women can do that aren't working in a steel manufacturing plant all day, but doing accounting and doing office tasks is more accessible for women. And lastly, women are finally educated at a near equal level to men. And so that allows them to compete for these service industry jobs because a lot of them have the same level of high school education as the men did. So in Eastern Europe, women have the most equal access. That's just in part because of communism and the way it works, where everyone is valued equally. But in Western Europe, we see this huge rise in married women working. Up to 40 to 70% of the married women are working by the 80s. And that's a jump from about 20% in the 30s and 40s. So we really do see this shift in demographics in terms of workforce and in terms of what women are expected to do and what they can do. Despite this, women do face serious discrimination in pay, their ability to advance up the workforce, and their occupational choice. They don't have the same opportunities that men do. And so this frustration leads to what's known as the women's movement of the 70s. And this emerges in the 70s for three kind of main reasons. One is those changes in motherhood and work that we just saw. The second is the growth of feminist intellectuals because women finally have the ability to learn at the same level as men. They are the first wave of feminist intellectuals at this time. And then the success of the civil rights movement in the United States really creates a strategy for creating change for a bunch of different groups. And so the women take advantage of this. Two of the main women in this movement are Simone de Beauvoir, and she writes a book called The Second Sex, where she argues that women are essentially free, but they're trapped by these stereotypical female roles and limiting conditions that we saw in terms of less pay, less opportunities, and gendered expectations. And then Betty Friedan writes a book called The Feminine Mystique, where she argues that women are not allowed to be mature adults, but are expected to fall into this infantile femininity that she calls it, where they're expected to act like children and be unable to take care of themselves. And she founds something known as the National Organization for Women to promote change, and that ends up becoming an international movement and a serious agent for change. And the women's movement focuses on kind of two main areas: laws in the workplace and then laws dealing with gender and family issues. So they push for like equal pay, equal working conditions, and then they also pay for women's right to divorce and things of that sort. The success of this movement paves the way for future equality movements as well. At the same time, the women are getting their voice out. The youth are trying to get their voice out through what's known as the counterculture movement, mostly in the 60s and 70s. And so this is a culture that really rebels against parents' authority and the status quo, really pushing for serious change. They defy the social norms and expectations that they have. They're living together before they're married, and they have a significantly more open sexuality. And this is in stark contrast to European society throughout the ages. And there's a number of reasons why this counterculture movement grows. First is the era of mass communication. People are experiencing culture the same way, and they're able to communicate more. It links the world together through TV, radio, telephone, music, those sorts of things. Then the baby boom of post-World War II means that this generation is proportionally a large part of the population. So they have power because they are such a significant percentage of the population. The economic prosperity gives them purchasing power, so they can buy. Advertisers are aiming to attract them. They are changing things for them. So that's significant. They have economic power. And then because there were so many good jobs available, they didn't have to conform to old standards. They didn't have to meet people's expectations. They could be themselves and still feel like they could get a job. And so we see that this leads to a rise in protests throughout Europe against the elitism of universities and kind of what they call the machinery of society, where people are just cogs in this machine that keeps going, and the elites are really running this. And so there's massive protests to demand the openness of universities, demand better access, and to demand a voice. And so those voices are eventually heard, but not until a radical protest takes over University of Paris, demand change. Eventually they're shut down. We see that this is a pushback to this counterculture is what's known as the conservative movement, which we'll look at in a minute here. In the midst of all of this comes a movement known as Détente. And Détente is this idea that perhaps we don't have to live in an era of rising tensions, but perhaps what we can do is relax those tensions and learn to work together. And this policy is really pursued mostly by West Germany and the chancellor known as Willy Brandt. And Willy Brandt's really a remarkable man in trying to ease the tensions of the Cold War. He works with Poland, the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia. They agree on borders that had been argued over for a number of times. And then he even starts working directly with East Germany. And this was a drastic change because neither Germany, really, before this had even recognized the right of the other to exist. But what Willy Brandt says is that there is one German nation, but there are currently two states. And so they would work eventually together to kind of solve that problem. Détente reaches its pinnacle in the Helsinki Conference of 1975. They agree not to change any European borders by force, so it's this agreement to leave things the way they are as the status quo. And they also add a series of human rights stipulations that say they will work together to ensure equal human rights for everybody. This eventually falls apart because there's distrust in the West that the Soviets are using this opportunity to simply build up their military to launch an attack. And then the Soviets do just that with an invasion of Afghanistan to allegedly support the communist regime that's falling apart, that has no support in Afghanistan. And as a result of this, the conservatives take power throughout the West, and they adopt a more strict policy towards the Soviet Union. So we move from détente back to an era of escalating tensions. As all of this is happening, there is massive economic fluctuation. So the 20 years immediately following World War II, there is just consistent economic growth. There's more jobs, there are better jobs, people's wages are going up, people have access to more things. Life is good. But there are some underlying problems in the economic world. And the first is an over-reliance on the US dollar within Europe. That was the standard which everyone was measuring against. It was against a gold standard, and it was just creating problems. And so everyone realized this kind of at the same time. They rushed to sell off their dollars, and this led to a panic in the 70s, which created some economic turmoil that was only exacerbated by an embargo by OPEC, which is the oil petroleum producing countries of the world, basically, of the Middle East. And this spike in oil price, they launched an embargo against the United States at the same time that they launched an attack on Israel, denying Israel's right to existence. And the United States is an ally of Israel, so they embargo. This leads to a spike in oil prices, which causes the whole economy to start to tumble. And European countries kind of stand by feeling like they can do nothing about it because there's such a reliance on oil. Eventually that embargo ends and recovery starts to begin. But as soon as that happens, there's revolution in Iran, and this spikes oil prices again significantly, quadrupling prices over the course of a year, and leading to massive fuel shortage. So this really puts a crimp in the whole economy, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. And so we see unemployment starts to rise significantly. Inflation's running rampant. This is causing major problems. And what's known as the misery index, which measures inflation and unemployment, starts to rise throughout the world. And the world feels like they're almost on the edge of falling into another Great Depression. Luckily, they don't. And a large part of that is because of the welfare state that had been set up in Western Europe. And that prevented people from losing everything because they still had that safety net from the government. Also, there's a push in the European Economic Community, which is an evolution of the common market. That's a step towards the EU. And this push is to continue despite the current economic struggles, to continue their push for a more broad European kind of camaraderie and cooperative effort in the economy. And so they push for this European unity, despite the economic struggles. And so these economic struggles also have massive impact throughout the world, not just on Europe in creating cooperation, but what we see is people move from optimism to pessimism, because in the 20 years that followed World War II, it seemed like nothing could go wrong. Everything was constantly getting better. Better jobs, new technology, new cars, new home appliances, making life easier. And then everything came crashing down. And although this welfare system saved many people, it also drained a lot of resources from the country, and so people began to push back against this. They felt that the government shouldn't be devoting all of their resources to these welfare programs. And so a new era of conservatism sweeps through Europe in the late 70s and 80s. And this leads to austerity measures, which is basically just a bunch of budget cuts to deal with the problem. And this austerity and this cutback cuts significantly into government programs, so people are kind of left on their own. The biggest cuts in austerity happen in the United States. Western Europe basically keeps their welfare state, but there is a little bit of modification under people like Margaret Thatcher in Britain. So this austerity is also applied to everyday life. People begin to cut back on some of the excesses that they had. They're taking on a little bit less debt. They're more concerned about health and wellness and nutrition. They're looking at their future, and they're pushing back on marriages getting married later because of economic concerns. And so there's really a sense of unease and a time of unease in the 80s. At the same time, there's also a rise in concern for the environment and wastefulness. People begin to see this kind of consumerism as maybe not the best thing. It may be leading to some problems throughout the world. And so that really represents this shift from optimism, the post-war optimism of maybe we can do this, to a more pessimistic tone of conservative sweeping through. And that's in the 80s and the late 70s and the early 80s.